I think the sort of first question that I would like to pose before I ask the audience if they have any questions, one thing that has become quite clear from today and from what you've all been saying is that there are some conflicting opinions. For example, you touched, Dr. Marsh, on the conflict that some process safety, for some process safety seems to trump personal safety. So what do you think is happening within the industry? Why are some risks perceived to be risks to some and not to others? And what can we be doing to create a bit of a level playing field?
Well, you mean the personal process safety? Do I need a microphone?
You should be mic'd up.
You mic'd
Tim? Oh, okay. Would you mind taking? Yes, thanks.
Okay. The personal process safety issue is it's a bit of a red herring, really. I think it's slightly political. We talked about vested interests and so on, and some of the behavioural safety work is poor and does put the focus on the individual, and people have got angry about that, but I think there's a bit of baby being thrown out with the bathwater with that, and if we just step back and realise that actually it is two sides of the same coin, that's an argument that just doesn't need to be had anymore, frankly.
Could I respond to that?
Yes, please do.
Process safety, is for refineries a loss of hydrocarbons. It has nothing to do with personal safety. It's defined as a loss of hydrocarbons. Am I right?
Well, I don't see how we can not distinguish between the two, because personal safety is referred to in our industry as slips, trips, and falls. And we have certain dynamics around that. We've improved some of the behavioral aspects for sure, and I agree with that totally. Process safety, the issue around process safety is that loss of containment is the worst outcome, the worst consequence of a failed process safety system. And as Dr. B defined it, it's the proactive, reactive, integrated processes of collaboration. We had comments earlier about LTIs, and yet we know there have been routine LTIs on the Horizon rig for several years that had never even been mentioned. So in regard to personal safety, and I think Jake might agree with this, are we going to rely on metrics that drive, frankly, fudged numbers and that also impact behaviors that are unacceptable? So how can we say that personal safety and process safety, while there's a linkage, are not important? Every other single industry, and particularly in the upstream industry, completely embrace and understand that concept.
That's where process safety came from, the upstream industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I'm not explaining myself very well. The point is that often you can find very quickly a genuine root cause that links to. I mean, Piper Alpha is a really good example. We all know the primary cause of Piper Alpha, along with lots of others, was that the permits were signed blind. But, the permits were signed blind, and it says, do not sign this unless you check that the housekeeping is straight. But it had notoriously poor housekeeping. So any root cause analysis of the poor housekeeping, which I would kind of put under the personal safety banner, if you want to put a banner on anything, and would have taken you straight to a problem with the permits, if you see what I mean. I just think, you've got process safety issues about containment, about toxins, about fire risk and so on, and you've got gravity to deal with. It's just a big risk factor.
But the difference in drilling, like a refinery or a production platform, can eventually be shut down. With the drilling, you're going to have a gusher that's going to go on until you drill relief wells. It's dynamic dealing.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying that some people seem to have said that looking at LTI figures and having good LTI figures somehow gives you any sort of assurance about process safety, and I don't think it does. It's just part of a jigsaw, and sometimes an unrelated part of a jigsaw.
That's true.
I think some of that is stemmed from our earlier panel, and maybe I didn't come across correctly, but I don't suggest that personal safety is not important. I suggest that at least in the past and recent past, I think people have falsely relied on LTIRs going down to say, therefore, we have no system safety problem. Absolutely. And that's that's what I'm saying. So I'm not saying forget about personal safety. I think you have to do both, and we're trying to elevate attention to process safety. Right.
I absolutely couldn't agree more.
I think that's a good clarification.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that has thrown up that across the industry there do seem to be, and that I'm just using that as one of the examples that if we are to move forward and tackle risks and discover what could be the next tipping point, is it not better to get the industry all agreeing, or is that never going to happen? Okay, well, do we have a question from the audience? Okay, if you could just bear with us, we'll get a microphone to you. And maybe perhaps if you would like to direct it to one of the panel members or just generally.
Excuse me, I'm going to try and tidy up. It's a bit of a general sort of question that I have.
Sorry, yes, right up close. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, there's a lot of people here, very, very experienced, and the biggest thing I keep hearing is people listening, communication, acting on safety. I agree that personal safety equates to sort of general safety within the platform or within the office. My point is that if you're talking about safety, does that relate to, and that's probably to Dr. Marshall, that is there a psychological behavior behind it? Because a lot of the times, and we talked about this earlier as well, being laughed at when you talk about safety or when you talk about anything and put your opinion forward, being laughed at and basically taken out of the occasion. And is there a psychological training required for mid-management to treat people differently then?
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest single influence on a teenager is what their peers think. And we learn it really early, and it's hugely influential. And absolutely, if you want somebody to do something they don't want to do, you use so many psychological levers to get them to do it. As we've discussed so many already today. And absolutely, I think a key element of risk literacy training is to teach supervisors just how easy it is to throw people. We do a little exercise, we would have done it today if your chairs were smaller, where we sit knee to knee and we teach body language reading. And this to illustrate the point that, how do people know what we want them to do? Well, we tell them all the time. That the culture of an organisation is just in the air. You walk into a bar, how long does it take you to work out you shouldn't be in this bar, it's dangerous, without anybody even looking at you? Because it's just in the air around you. And likewise, you can go to a rougher bar and tell instantly that it's fine. So supervisors are absolutely central to all of that. And the more we can train them and the more we can look out for them overstretching the elastic band, the better.
William, would you like to add anything there?
I mean, it's interesting in terms of people's personal security, and it's a very subjective subject. So one worker might come to you and say, I don't feel safe in this location. Another one might say, actually, no, I feel perfectly safe. And actually that becomes, because it's so subjective, then the answer will always be, are you happy that all the processes are in place, which should be? But then what should those processes be? So it's a big sort of circle argument. But actually it comes down to, if an individual is not happy, then they should have the right just to put their hand up and say, no, something is wrong here. Because if I think there's something wrong here, probably somebody else does as well. And that takes a lot of personal courage to do that, especially on a rig site or any other sort of installation, because by nobody else saying anything, they think they're the only person.
Okay, I can summarise this. Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote all the best-selling books, he summarises this as saying, look, if you feel uncomfortable somewhere, you're a bloody idiot if you don't work out why standing near a door.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that summarises it, doesn't it?
Much better.
I think there's an issue too based on behavioral-based safety, and I'm a huge believer in behavioral-based safety. If you look and if you put some key issues in the Macondo in perspective, they had absolute evidence that geoscientists agreed with all the way down to the floor hands. They knew those conditions weren't normal. We have not hesitated in this industry, which is part of our improvement, to call stop work. with respect to slips, trips, and falls. What is it about our industry when folks know things are not normal for a driller or a junior tool pusher or a tool pusher or a company man to say, no, it's not right, we have to stop? That's the fear that we have to overcome. We have to be able to intercede on that critical path. And as I demonstrated before with pure numbers, there's always value in that, even if it's for the least of consequences of a given risk. So when we extend that behavioral-based pattern to issues that involve the critical path, that's when we truly begin to save lives in the environment. It's also when we begin to once again become a reliable industry, a highly reliable industry.
Brian over there. Sorry.
Sorry,
We'll
just one thing to follow up. I appreciate the answers. We went back to 2000, so that's 13, 14 years ago. And this is ongoing sort of a series of different risk assessments and everything. Why do you think this hasn't been solved yet? We always go back to middle management. Do you think people are promoted too early without the experiences required and then they become different behaved person?
Lauren, do you think you could answer that? Would you be able to?
Well,
Dr. Marsh, thank you.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of the question again? Sorry.
Sorry about that. I'm just wondering, do you think the people are promoted earlier than they should to the positions where they have not experience, not managed properly, and their behavior change because they're all of a sudden in charge of a position that,
So in other words, that they haven't been in the position long enough to know that they've been doing it. Yeah, I think that certainly came into play, as you heard from Lillian's presentation. I mean, on the Deepwater Horizon, a lot of people were moved around at the last minute. It's something that you see in a lot of these operations. People get moved around a lot. And so not only do they not necessarily have a chance to grow into the leadership role in a particular position, but they know they're not going to be growing into it because the culture is such that the company keeps moving people around. And so when they come in, for example, this happened in Texas City at the refinery where, managers would come in, they'd know they'd be there for a couple of years. So, you're not looking long term. And when you're looking at how do you meet the cost projections that you have to meet, that you're going to be held accountable for, well, it's easy to put off things like safety and maintenance because it's hard to show a bottom line result from that at the end of the quarter, And so what happens is you can't cut the operations, you've got to cut from somewhere, and it's always safety and maintenance that winds up being sacrificed as a result. And if you're the guy who's running everything and you're the one that's on the line for that, you're just hoping you can make it through until you get moved somewhere else, and then the next guy will have to come in and worry about that. And so that's definitely contributes to some of these issues.
There's another critical problem right now, the great crew change. For people in my generation, David, we're going to be retiring. I mean, you had the privilege of hearing Lord Cullen today. I mean, we're not always going to be around, but we're trying to pass the torch to this next generation. So there's going to be a lot of inexperienced people that really need to learn these things.
Learn the lessons.
And just following up on that, I mean, that was something that happened within BP in the late 90s or so. Also, was you had a lot of people that had retired from the company in the 80s when gas prices or when oil prices had dropped significantly, and this was true of a lot of companies. But so as a result, you had kind of this gap in the experience base where they were really short, sort of top level executives. And one of the things that John Brown did, he promoted people like Tony Hayward that were sort of put on a fast track because they needed to get executive talent up to the top ranks more quickly, and so they had kind of this program. In fact, they had a name for it, and I'm drawing a blank on it. But
turtles.
Anyway,
they were turtles.
Well, they were the turtles, but the program had there was a leadership program, and they had a name for it, and I don't remember what it was called. But anyway, the point was that they recognized that they had this gap, and it was true. A number of other companies were in the same boat. So there was kind of this effort to basically push people up the line, more quickly than they might have otherwise have gone.
Okay, thank you. Brian, you have the microphone over there.
I guess there's This one's for the whole panel. A lot of discussion today about LTI, LTIR, metrics. I think it was Galileo who said, count what is countable, measure what is measurable. And if it's not measurable, find a way to measure it. Continuous improvement in Six Sigma say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So which metrics would you choose as a panel to improve our perspective on risk going forward?
Mark, would you like to start there?
Why don't you start with someone else? I'll think about that for a second.
Okay, William, yeah.
I'll defer
There
my
was an
answer.
interesting example, and it doesn't answer your question at all. But I was asked by the head of HSE for one oil company, and we were designing a new risk matrix for them with a load of checks and balances in it. And the last sort of overriding factor within that was that he could make a decision to override the metrics. And then he said to me, can you design me another metrics to override my override? Which is a complete back to front on the whole thing. So if I need to sort of leap over what we've designed over the last 6 months, how can I do that in a day? So you go through, you try and find a whole other set of metrics to turn something quite qualitative into something quantitative, i.e. so you can measure it and prove and say if it's 65% that, we're going to make that decision. It's pretty much utterly, well, it's impossible. So you have to try, and you can get as close to as you possibly can get to it, but I don't think you're going to get any closer than sort of 80% of circumstances. But that 20% is where things will go really wrong.
Would anybody else like to add?
I think that's really a fascinating question, and I'm going to answer it probably different than most people would. I don't think it's about the metrics we use specifically. I think it's about the ones we don't use. We don't have good leading metrics. We have a lot of reactive metrics. We have a lot of metrics that tell us what we did wrong or should have done different after the fact. But what if we have metrics like I submitted at the Center of Offshore Safety, and Lillian witnessed what happened to the question. Kicks, losses, days of wellbore instability, stuck pipe incidents. Those things show us where we're really breaking down on our engineering issues. Management of change. How many times have we issued management of changes? We had the expectation in one company, and this actually happened, that when you first start really integrating and embracing management of change, it'll go zoop. And does it fall off? Well, what happens is that we fail to recognize what really is creating the changes. I mean, there was a little known thing kind of overlooked in Lillian's presentation. Why did BP change out its top management in 2009 that was absolutely driven to process safety? Management of change. I submit that it's more that we sometimes refuse to look at leading metrics as opposed to the metrics we actually are using. Companies don't want to look at the numbers of kicks and losses because usually there are enormous reasons behind them. We drill too fast, we ignore the engineering design, we don't have good procedures, we're not integrating and collaborating with our geoscientists. It's the things we're not doing. And I think that's more problematic than some of the metrics that we embrace. To me, a drill time curve is meaningless. An MPT curve is meaningless unless you understand what's behind them. And not only that, but understand the kicks and losses and things that create the typical 40% plus MPT in deep water. And it's actually worse than that, because in over 40% of those wells, we entirely fail to meet objectives. So if we're not meeting objectives, if we have an ordinary amount of time, sometimes those numbers just become meaningless. We have to have numbers that tell us where we need to focus, and they do not exist.
Yes, Dr. Marshall. Oh, we'll give you the mic.
I mean, obviously, I agree with all of that and measuring and analysing kicks and so on. From a cultural point of view, I think it's quite simple. You apply basic 360-degree feedback techniques, and you get out and about on the shop floor and you ask, well, how many times is the curious why question being asked? And then somebody doing something with the answer. How many times is the proactive, anything slow, uncomfortable or inconvenient question being asked, and somebody doing something with the answer when that comes back? How many times were people coached when there was an opportunity to coach rather than told? You know, how many times did people fail to lead by example? How many times were people engaged and involved in a decision when they could have been? You know, and how often were people praised rather than criticised? And the flip side of the fence is, how engaged are the workforce, or how pissed off are they? You know, and a good answer to those simple questions will tell you an awful lot about your culture, and a lot of the other stuff will be downstream of that, I would argue.
How do you measure how effective all that's been?
So how do you
Measure how effective all that is?
Oh, a battery of scores from everything from how many people are wearing their hard hats, how good is the housekeeping, how many people are holding the handrail, right through to all the stuff that, you know, we've just been discussing on the right here.
I know in one company too, it's also behaviors, because they recognize when they finally threw out management of change as a global standard, they were getting a lot of them, and it made them realize that, you know what, we're not really doing a great job planning these wells. I say in a lot of training sessions that I've given, drilling hazard management begins with well planning, not on the rig floor. So it drove especially the excelling organizations to want to do better and actually plan their wells better.
Okay, I want to move on to try and squeeze in a few more questions. Jake, would you like to ask a question? You had your hand up.
Hi, Jake Malloy. I agree entirely with David that we need to do the figures on the well, and that goes back to what we were saying earlier on with the sharing of information and learnings from these events. But if I can, I'd like to pick up on Tim's point, because it was me that said that LTI is a lot of crap this morning. And the reason I said that is because I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an engineer, I don't do measuring, I don't do analysing, I just listen to the complaints we get on a day-to-day basis from workers. And that comes in repeatedly from especially drilling workers in actual fact, and especially in the UK sector. The reason being that you fly out to rigs just now and they've got the great big sign as you land on a heli deck saying 7 years LTI free, some of them 9 years LTI free, and yet guys have gone off in stretchers from those rigs. And the reason that figure isn't counted is because under the IADC rules, they don't get included in the lost time injury figures. So it distorts the figures. And what that does, again, I'm not a psychologist, but this is what my perception is, what that does is discredit completely the idea that the company is recording things accurately. And when you've got that discredited system, which is being held up as the means of measuring, the culture is irreparably damaged, and workers then don't believe. You know, I think what underpins a lot of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve is trust and respect. And if you lose the trust and respect in management because they're distorting the figures, you're on a seriously slippery slope.
Would you like to reply?
Yeah, well, it's a very simple reply, really. You know, when you articulate it like that, I agree with every word you say. But just dismissing LTI figures, all LTI figures as crap, I think is unhelpful. You know, I've got a couple of friends when I do the circuit and they do inspirational speakers who are in wheelchairs. If you said that near them, you'd lose your arm, you know. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious of time. I do want to address one of the aims of today's conference, in case we do run to time now. So, Mark, I'd like to ask it to you. You know, we've heard experiences from both sides of the Atlantic. How do we make sure that the initiative begun here today by this conference and its subsequent learnings are hopefully shared and implemented across the industry globally?
Well, I mean, I think this is the starting point is this dialogue, and even if there's disagreements about this, just having the exchange and not forgetting. I mean, I think Lillian's presentation was very powerful, that putting faces to this whole incident in Macondo and not forgetting, And I also think it's to me it's at the high levels of organizations there has to be a clear listening and learning from this. That some of this is driven, in my opinion, by the organization's decisions, and that's where I veer a little bit from the behavioral-based safety approach. In theory, I think it can work fine. But whose behavior are we looking at? That's a question I have a lot. Right. But I think often programs are focused on the line workers. So if you're thinking about organizational behavior, what are organizations doing about this, as well as the workers? Then I think that's the lessons I hope that come out of this, is that a lot of decisions, months leading up to this, workers were saying, we should do something. I mean, it wasn't that workers weren't raising their hand and saying, our behaviors are wrong here. There's a problem. But there's also power dynamics that play into this. And you can't just say, improve your behavior on the rig. And I know you're not saying that, but I'm just saying I think that's the lessons that have to be
One thing
learned.
that we all seem to be, you all seem to be in agreement with, is that we need to share information, but that's not necessarily been that successful up until now. I mean, you said that some people, involved in Macondo weren't really even aware of the Piper Alpha disaster. So, lessons weren't
That's a tragedy in the United States. When the BBC film first came out, we were showing it. And then in the bust in the 90s, and everybody retired, it wasn't shown as much. By the 2000s, it wasn't shown at all. And it just became something that happened a long time ago. But for drilling, everybody in drilling said, oh, that was a production problem. That has nothing to do with drilling.
But are we in agreement that sharing the information is the way forward?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of sharing and communicating this stuff is terribly important. And one of the things we struggle with in the U.S. is that, as David was alluding to, we don't have a lot of data that we need to make these decisions. There's just a sort of a dearth of data, certainly in the Gulf of Mexico, when it relates to things like kicks and near-miss data and things like that. And so it's very hard for companies. Some companies track it internally, some companies don't, but there's no sharing of this information. And so it's very hard to know how the industry overall is progressing. Are things getting safer? Are things getting less safe? I actually give a whole talk raising the question, is the Gulf safer now than it was before Macondo? And the answer is, we really don't know, because we don't have enough data to really assess what's going on out there. So, it's all part of this sort of collaborative effort. It's communication up and down the line from the chain of command within the companies, and it's also communication within the companies and within the industry. And that's why I said earlier today, I hope that SPE chapters in the U.S. take up this cause and have similar discussions, because I think it's terribly important to get this conversation going.
And I'd love to add just one more point to that. Now, I know we're running on time here, and it is also a challenge, Anthony. I think one of the most difficult things to change is going to be the attitudinal dynamic that's been created since the 90s. We used to train folks how to listen to wells, and it's not intuitive art, it's physics. It's the physics of drilling. Summation of force equals 0. It's pretty much that simple. But we have migrated, and the great crew change really began in the 90s with this drilling in the 90s concept. But we've migrated to somehow think it's okay just to speed through and blow hole and put the Kelly down, and it's not. One of the dynamics that's going to be the most difficult to change, and I think frankly that lies clearly within the auspices of SPE, is going to be able to convince our engineers that there is true value in stopping, looking, and listening. That's where the money will be made. That's where lives will be lost. That's where dollars will be saved. And until we can convince our engineers and our engineering organizations that we need to get back to what we did well for years, and then use the technology like real-time data effectively, then once again we can be reliable. So we have to make it incumbent on our engineering organizations to help drive that change.
and it's actually financially beneficial to do things right in the beginning. It's really good for our investors.
Well, I'm sorry, but we are going to have to draw it to a close. Unfortunately, the clock is beating us. We could take questions all night, I'm sure, but everybody has homes to go to. And we did say that we'd try and bring this project in on time. So I think we have. I'd like to say a very sincere thank you to everyone for attending today and to all our guest speakers and our panellists from this morning. I hope you've found it useful and thought-provoking also. Today wouldn't have been possible without the support of our sponsors, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all on behalf of SPE Aberdeen. I'm just going to name check them quickly. We have our supporting sponsor Petrotechnics, our networking area sponsor Shell, our delegate bag sponsor Survitec, our lanyard sponsor Successful Energy, our print sponsor Printograph, and media sponsors SPE Review, and of course our associate sponsors Weatherford, Europa Energy, Step Change and Safety, and Integrated Office Services. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a safe journey home.
Thank you.